In a recent report by the Pew Research Center on the status of Judaism in America, statistics are out and it doesn't look very good. So let me give you some of the highlights of that result. So first of all, there's 1 in 5 Jews in America nowadays do not consider Judaism, are not Jewish by religion. This is what they call Judaism by religion versus Jews of no religion. That's the terminology they came up with. Exactly how they came up with this and why they couldn't just call them religious Jews versus secular Jews, I'm not sure. But Jews by religion is 80% and 20%, one out of 5 are Jews of no religion. So to simplify things, I'm just going to call them secular Jews, okay? Jews of no religion, meaning a Jew who defines primarily their Judaism not by being religious, but rather by something else, either because I was born Jewish, or because I consider myself culturally Jewish. I eat kneidlich and kishkes and whatever. Okay, so 1 out of 5 define themselves as Jews primarily due to their affiliation with something non-religious. Okay, 1 out of 5. So so this is pretty troubling, because if you look back, according to the Pew Research Center, if you not if you look back, but if you ask the previous generations, okay, meaning the ones who are older, the older respondents, for them the rate of Jewish by religion, the religious Jews, is much higher. So among the greatest generation, meaning the generation before the GI generation, the one that fought in World War II, so among that generation it's 93 versus 7% are Jews by religion, religious Jews. And then it goes down to 86 and 81, and then Generation X, my generation, is 74% are religious Jews. And then the youngest generation, the millennial generation, is 68%. A little over 2 in 3 are religious Jews, and the remaining are secular. But it gets a lot worse. Now listen to this. 62%, okay, 2/3 of Jewish people say that being Jewish is primarily a matter of culture. Meaning even those who characterize themselves as religious Jews, okay, this is a very important thing to note. Even those who characterize themselves as religious, they still think that being Jewish is primarily a matter of ancestry. Okay, now, but when I said it gets worse, here's how it gets worse. Okay, 80% of secular Jews, Jews of no religion, quote unquote, 80% of secular Jews intermarry. They marry non-Jewish people. And if you intermarry, you are likely, very likely, not to raise your children religious. Some of them do raise them Jewish, but most of them don't. And here is the worst thing, perhaps worse depending, of course, on your perspective, but from the perspective of Jewish sympathizers, 6 out of 10 Jews married after 2000 have a non-Jewish spouse. Did you hear that number? Meaning, more likely than not, okay, more people than don't. If you get married after the year 2000, okay, more Jews than not marry non-religious people. So, non-Jewish people, I'm sorry. They intermarry. So, so this is, oh my God, this is like crazy. Because remember, there's a very strong correlation between intermarriage and not raising your children Jewish. Not to speak of the fact that if the mother is not Jewish, then halachically speaking, from an Orthodox standpoint, the children are not Jewish, which means that the Orthodox will never accept them as Jewish. And yeah, and even among conservative, it's, you know, up in the air. So so that's it. Okay, but here are other very important revelations in the survey. Now listen to this. 52%, more than half of people who grow up Orthodox are no longer Orthodox. Did you hear that number? 52% among Jewish people who say that they grew up Orthodox also claim that they no longer practice Orthodoxy. So so that's a very startling number. And the numbers go on. If you were raised conservative, then 60% of the people who were raised conservative say they no longer practice conservatism, and they practice something more liberal, meaning either Reform, 30% practice Reform, and 30% practice other. So it could be Jewish Renewal, it could be what is it called, Kaplan's version, Reconstructionism, and it could be just none. Okay, no affiliation, meaning secular Jews. Actually, no, that's not related. Just don't belong to any movement, any denomination. Okay, it's not the same as secular Jews, because you could have a secular Jew who actually is affiliated with with an Orthodox movement, perhaps even, or conservative or whatever. Okay, so these numbers are pretty alarming. So the question here is like this: how do we, both as a Jew in general and perhaps as a religious Jew, how do we react to this? And are these numbers accurate, and can we learn something from these numbers? So there is a response in the Jewish Forward by J.J. Goldberg. I don't know who this is. I don't even know if it's a man or a woman. And he or she, I'm assuming that it's a woman for some reason. So she's very not happy with this report. So he claims it's all misleading and it's all based on wrong information. She says, like, very emphatically, no, not wrong as in, I think there's a better way to interpret those numbers. Wrong as incorrect, erroneous. Whoops. And then she goes on to say that this report was based on a 2000 Jewish population survey, a JPS survey, not based on. It is being compared to a JPS survey in which the survey shows that when they did that survey, if you didn't have a strong Jewish affiliation, then they didn't count you. So they basically discounted many people who didn't have a strong Jewish connection. So since they were so strict in their definition of who should count towards this survey, in other words, who is Jewish, right? Who should be included in this questionnaire, in this survey? And since they were so strict, so basically it is a very flawed report, and the Pew Research Center is comparing their survey to that survey, and therefore the whole thing is screwed up. The whole thing is botched up because of that. But she's wrong. She's very wrong, because the Pew Research Center actually is not comparing themselves to the JPS 2000 report. And so I don't know where she gets off. She goes on and on. It's a very long article, but I'm just startled. I'm puzzled by this whole thing. Like, what is she trying to say here? She's trying to say, basically, her premise is that it's not as bleak as you make it out to be. Okay, it's not like the whole thing is just rapidly going under. But she's not addressing the crux of the matter, which is that 6 out of 10 people marrying after 2000 are marrying a non-Jewish spouse. Like, the real question she's not addressing. Like, she keeps focusing on, you're comparing it to JPS, which is something that I'm not even aware of. Like, how do you know that they're comparing it to the JPS survey at all? But so I don't know what's going on there. But let me address a different question. There is a certain, growing up in New York especially, there is this gut instinct that there was this aura of religiosity and of strong adherence to one's heritage and ancestry and culture in New York City. And so it feels, and it feels that people are becoming more, I'm not going to use the term religious, but more, they're moving to the right. Okay, they're identifying more with their heritage. And whether by means of culture or religion. Okay, so the question is, does this mesh, does this dovetail, is this consistent with the Pew Research Center report? And it would seem that it isn't. But, and certainly I myself have had this feeling. And there's, of course, this famous book, Sliding to the Right, and there have been many other reports that have documented that in the recent decades, the 70s, 80s, 90s, there's been a major surge in Orthodox sentiment and greater commitment, greater adherence, greater practice of the Jewish religion. And so, how do we reconcile these two phenomena? And so this is a big paradox, in my opinion. And here is my explanation for this. Here's my explanation. I think both are true. I think that it depends on how narrow or how broad your perspective is. I think that over time, in the long run, I think there's a very definite moving to the left, not moving to the right. People become more secular over time as they become better educated, and as the levels of the standard of living go up. and just intelligence goes up, and familiarity with contemporary culture goes up. So as all of those things happen, people tend to identify less with their particular ethnic groups. So this is what you call universalism, right? Universalism. This is something that the classical reform talked a lot about, and so even though classical reform is no longer practiced, it's still something that is still happening. Okay, people are still moving overall, in general. Okay, we have a society where people tend to become assimilate. They assimilate in the American population. So why does it seem that the opposite is happening? And the answer is, in my opinion, that there is a watershed moment in Jewish history after World War II. And you might, obviously I can't pinpoint exactly when that moment was, but let's, for argument's sake, let's say it was 1967, okay? That's, of course, the year that the Israelis won in the 1967 war, the Six-Day War. And so, what do I mean by a watershed moment? Up until then, people have been consistently becoming less and less religious. Okay? More and more assimilationist, dropping their old practices, sometimes dropping it as soon as they arrived in America, sometimes it took up to a generation, but it happened. And those that didn't drop significantly reformed and modernized their practice. Okay, so up until 1967, this is virtually across the board, consistent, reliable. You didn't have anything, any pushback. Then after 67, you have this major trend of shoring up those who decided to stay behind, those who decided to adhere to their practices. Now they're starting to shore up their own practices. So now in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you have these communities, these Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox communities are going up, and they are resisting assimilation and resisting Americanizing and everything that goes with it. So this is why it's a little misleading, because this is a relatively new phenomenon, but here's the important thing. Okay, so why is this not reflected in the numbers? And the answer is because there's actually a counter trend, which is that many, as this survey correctly indicated, that many Orthodox people who grew up Orthodox, and of course it's mostly people who are not ultra-Orthodox. So we're talking here about, like YU type, okay, Yeshiva University, Stern College, those types of orthodoxy, Breuer and such. So those types of orthodoxy, they tend to, there's a large number of them who no longer consider themselves Orthodox later in life. So even though they grew up Orthodox, and nominally they are taught, and at the beginning they were observing halakha more or less, but later in life they don't consider it relevant, it's just not practical, it doesn't work, and they no longer would consider themselves Orthodox. So this is this kind of acts as a countervails the trend of the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox, to have many children, to have large families. So in that respect, the Orthodox denomination is growing, but with respect to people who are leaving, okay, so there are many people who are leaving, so that's why the numbers are stable. So again, to address the question of are we becoming less religious or more religious, I think that overall we're becoming less religious, but there was a recent trend after the 1967 of those who stayed to become even more religious. Okay, so it's not that the numbers are not growing. The numbers are not growing. It's just the people who are already Orthodox, they are basically creating a barrier, and they're becoming even more Orthodox. And of course, there's some of them who are conservative who are also drifting towards Orthodoxy or taking up practices that their parents or they themselves have dropped previously. Okay, so that's again part of this watershed phenomenon, as I explained, right? That those on the right become even more religious, and those on the left and the liberals become less religious. Okay, and the middle gets hollowed out. So, but the critical thing to keep in mind is that in the long term, from a broad perspective, people become more liberal. The only reason why it seems that people are becoming more religious is that those who have decided, those who have made a conscious decision to doggedly remain inside the ranks of strong observance of tradition, among that community, it has become even stronger. By the way, this is actually a hedge against assimilation. Okay, but I don't want to get into a long discussion on its own. But the reason why this happened is because they saw, hey, the ones who have compromised, right, have wound up being not religious at all. So therefore, we're gonna ratchet it up a notch. We're gonna be even more religious, right? So, but the key thing to remember is that it's only those who have made that decision. Okay, so it's a relatively small, it's a relatively limited sector of the Jewish population at large, and there are few people who are making the decision to join that sector. Okay, so this is why overall there's going to be a liberalization of Jewish practice and sentiment.